Okay, I'm not sure if the live stream is working. Okay, yep, it looks like it is. So, all righty. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm Catherine Boyle with the Key Ministry team. And if you follow our work, you know that we have webinars on mental health focused topics from time to time. And that's what we're doing today. We're going to be addressing something that may not be a topic that you're overly familiar with, but I think everybody in our culture has heard of allegations of abusive behavior, and that sometimes allegations are not always true. In fact, just looking up some statistics for this particular, this particular webinar, there's actually a huge amount of people every year that endure allegations that rise to, a level of some outside party getting involved. And those things are completely untrue. So because of this very important and sensitive topic, we really felt like it was something that church leaders needed to be aware of and just kind of have some mental information and hopefully maybe some other resources as well. If you find yourself encountering a situation like this within your church or your local community, because these things are happening to real people. And I would just add too that if you aren't familiar with this, I encourage you to look at a Facebook group. There's one Facebook group that I'm sure there's many, but there's one that I'm familiar with, and it's called Parents Behind the Pinwheels. And we'll link to all the resources that are mentioned today. We'll link to those We'll link to those in our show notes afterwards. But just read through some of those stories and see what those parents have gone through. It can be really just heartbreaking. So discernment is what this kind of scenario is all about. And I found this wonderful quote from Charles Spurgeon, who's one of the early church or the church fathers, probably 150, 200 years ago, who said, discernment is not knowing the difference between right and wrong. It's the difference between right and almost right. And so, a lot of times lies and deception have a little bit of truth woven in. And so it can be really difficult and challenging. So I do have a guest with us today. I'm happy to introduce to you Shelly Roberts. Shelly and I have been connected over the years through Key Ministry. She's a member of the writing team. She is an incredible human being. Oh my goodness, I don't know how she does her daily life, but I'll let Shelly just tell you a little bit about who she is and her family. And, and that will be our entree into this important conversation today. So Shelly, welcome to this webinar.
Thank you. We live in a very rural area in central Illinois and have a little tiny country church. And it's so encouraging to me to see all that Key Ministry is doing to give resources to those that are serving in all kinds of places. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, that's just a side note there that it's been really encouraging for me. Actually, in the last few years, we've been pretty much homebound. That was pre-COVID for us, and then during COVID. And so online resources became our lifeline, really. So we're really grateful for that. So I'm happy to join you today. We have 8 kids total, kind of 2 families. We have 3 boys that are all grown and married and having babies. So I think we're up to 7 grandbabies now.
Wow.
So it's a busy place.
Yeah.
My Amazon cart is often, getting developmental toys now for each stage. I'm like, I'm buying these things, but it's have little ones coming to enjoy that. And then we have 5 at home. Yep. So we have girls that are 17, 15, and then our middle 2 are 12 and 11, and they are both very medically complex. And what you would consider total care. So whatever done in a day's time, from wiping their eye to giving medications or whatever, they need someone to do that for them. And then our youngest is 7, and she brings a whole different batch of needs to our crew. My husband's a contractor. And so he works as a self-employed contractor. People ask me all the time, like, do I have a job? And I don't know how to start anymore. So
you don't have anything but a job, Shelly. I mean, that's
basically my job is keeping everyone out of the ICU. That's like the days. So this is not what I planned on doing in my 40s at all. It's not what we envisioned. And, through a whole chain of events, this is where God brought us. And I truly cannot imagine my lifestyle being any other way at this time.
Well, and one thing I wanted to say that you guys adopted these 5 kids, the 5 younger ones. So, okay.
Yeah, so it was a little bit different from what some of your families having kids born to them, where you have no choice in the matter, right? It just happened. So ours was definitely a process of kind of stepping into the world of medically complex kids, and ours started through foster care. And then we're very happily retired as foster parents. We no longer have a foster license. We have no room in the inn.
Yes.
And so we are very content with just caring for our kids now, and then grandkids, of course, on top of that. So
right. So you don't have to get into a ton of detail, but just what are some of the challenges that, in particular, the middle 2 that require complete care? What are some of the things that they require for just daily living? I mean, I'm aware, but I'm sure that our viewers may not be aware of just some of the things that have to be done on a daily basis.
So their diagnoses, they started out when they were a little bit younger, not quite as complex. And as things progress through the years, our daughter has trach and vent. She's on TPN, so she has gut failure, intestinal failure. And so everything for her is through IV. It's incredible what we can do from home. We're just so blessed to have those services. Otherwise, in the hospital setting, she would be living in an ICU. Some type of down unit, but that would be where she's at level of care wise. And so through having the different providers, we can do so much here. And our goal is always, our 2 kids especially are very medically complex, but we try to take away as much of that as we can and just focus on normal family. So one section of our house does literally look kind of like a hospital, but it's hidden behind cabinetry. And, we try to keep life as simple as possible. Both of our kids require 24-hour care. So we have night nursing. If we do not have that filled, I become night shift. And so my husband is extremely hands-on. So we do a lot of training. If one child's in the hospital, the other one's home. We can literally just tag team at the door. And that was definitely a choice. And we were very purposeful in that, so that we can, cover those bases when there are needs with even extended family. If there's a particular special event that's happening, he can cover and I can be there, or vice versa. So neither of our kids communicate in a typical way. So they have lots of gestures.
So they're both nonverbal.
Yes. So that becomes very complicated in the medical world. Just as people are trying to understand what their needs are. And as a caregiver, you are the one that becomes that person that's trying to communicate. And in particular, as we look at accusations for families, that puts you very susceptible, is for our daughter, she has extreme pain syndromes. That pain really pain? Why is that pain? Is that pain because mom said it's pain, or is that pain because, it's been documented as an official medical, descriptive that is pain? And so we've had our challenges through the years with that, and her being treated as she should be. And, our son, he's very emotional. And so if he's in a little bit of pain, he'll cry at a 10, right? And all this stuff, running to see what he might need, and, what give him to help, relieve his symptoms. And Joy does not cry, but her body just goes rigid and she suffers. And so that's probably one of our biggest challenges.
I can imagine.
that.
Yeah, I mean, and actually, I was having a similar conversation today about people's pain thresholds. I mean, it sounds like your son is, is somebody who maybe has a very low tolerance for pain naturally, whereas Joy is probably, has a much higher threshold, but, her body is responding to whatever's going on. So,
and I
yeah,
try
that's
to
interesting.
remind staff that, think of her, we often will use the example now as she's gotten older of that elderly person or that adult person who had a stroke,
right?
And they no longer communicate to you the way they once did. And so you have to watch body movements, touch the body. Are they rigid and just, flailing in pain, or are they relaxed and comfortable? You can tell so much by the nonverbal. So I think it's just something, as we've gone through this process of when I give those particular things as an example, people relate to that, respond differently than if I just compare her to her peers that have seen,
because that makes perfect sense.
People that have had traumatic brain injury, it's all similar. Any of us that having the same needs that Joy has if we had an accident, whatever. So, yeah.
Well, so I before we scheduled this, I actually reached out to a couple of other people that I know, who have, who have used different medical providers to help come alongside their family, the paid help similar to what you all have, and have experience. I mean, this is kind of the world that we operate in, and it was pretty consistent that people are very familiar with this topic of being falsely accused of abuse. Most of them had similar experiences or were certainly aware that these kinds of things happen, and they were not willing to talk about it yet because there can be long-term consequences from talking about these things publicly. And so I just want to say that before you kind of jump into what happens with your family, to let the viewers know that this is, this is not an easy thing to be talking about. And, so I'm not going to pressure you to reveal anything that you absolutely are not comfortable with revealing in this situation at all. We will make time for some questions. If you have anything that comes to mind, definitely submit it in the chat if you're on the webinar. I'm also monitoring our Facebook page, but I'm solo today. Beth couldn't join me. So definitely, send us any questions there. And as we're able, we will work those in. So I became aware, really quickly that something really dreadful was happening with your family earlier this year. I've had the privilege to be part of a prayer team that supports the Roberts family. And so tell us, just kind of an overview of what happened with your family that led to us talking about this today.
Yes. So a little bit different for us was we were already foster parents. So we knew the nuts and bolts of what can happen, right? And we had served children that were, our particular kids weren't victims of that type of abuse, but that's the type of the system we worked in, where we were on the side of DCFS and working together to try and bring, wellness to kids, safety, safe place for them to thrive. And so I had often imagined what that would be like to be on the other side, right? Because as you took care of kids, you thought about their birth families, and you tried to think about what must that have been like for them, you know? So it's much different when it's you are the one on the receiving end of the knock at the door. Our knock at the door came in January, and I was right in the middle of doing all the medical cares for our kids in the morning. So it's a pretty intense hour of, you wouldn't just invite anyone into the room. It's kind of like if you were in a hospital setting and the curtains were pulled and you're trying to take care of what you need to discreetly. And right in the midst of all of that, administering all of our medications, getting my other kids ready for the day, the knock at the door came, and my daughter called me to come to the door. And there was someone at the door she didn't recognize. And I knew as soon as I opened the door, our lives would never be the same. No matter what happened, no no matter why they were there, I knew when that happened, you're already stepping into trauma. And my
Right.
other children who had already, been on the receiving end of so much trauma, it's like this is happening in slow motion or almost fast motion in front of you. And you're realizing the weight of, oh goodness, like this knock has come now. I know what's to come. We have no control over anything. And your instinct is to protect your kids, right?
Right,
and so
of course.
need to do to protect your kids. And the unique thing I think that families find themselves in is you're kind of removed from being able to do that when there's any kind of an allegation. So that natural instinct as a parent is to, care for the well-being of our children. And all of a sudden the law is coming in and standing in the middle of that, to where we often felt in our process that we were like being forced to neglect our children because we were no longer being able to be right there, with them. So our situation came kind of strangely. We had a very new investigator. I was thinking interviewer, might as well be an interviewer, but investigator, very new investigator. And he really came to me bewildered. He couldn't figure out who in the world would say these things about us. And so he was looking to me to kind of like prove their case of why would someone do this? Who is this? Because everything of ours was anonymous. And I did not realize how much power is in an anonymous thing. An anonymous call can be something that someone just has a personal issue in their own lives. And it's all anonymous, but then for this family, it rips them completely apart and puts their children in things that are just horrific. All because of some anonymous claim because someone got their feelings hurt or what have you.
Yeah, let me just interject here. It is not uncommon for caregivers, and I'm not, pointing a finger or trying to speak to anything in your situation, but just as an example, if this was an example given to me that, caregivers who are in the home, who are paid staff, either, not showing up to work or showing up late, being high or drunk when they're taking care of your child that they're hired to take care of, or stealing from you, either, medication or other valuables in the home, and they get fired. And so boop, there goes the allegation. And, anybody can make any kind of accusation against anyone. I mean, at any time. And we all know that lies, I don't know who said this, but lies go all the way around the earth before the truth puts its shoes on, or something to that effect. So I didn't want you to, I didn't want to interrupt, but I just wanted people to be aware the danger and the power of what has happened in your family.
Yes. So for us, like, we'll never be able to go back and know for sure. It's never disclosed to you who's causing this harm by a false allegation. For us, we've tried to just really discern other areas of our life that we have people that aren't safe in our lives, that don't care the best for our family or the best for our kids. And so all of a sudden, yes, you're thrown into this and you don't know who to trust, right? You don't know who has said these things about you. I actually had never heard of Munchausen's. That term came up, and I remember thinking, I can tell you almost every diagnosis there is about so many areas of medicine, right? Like, Munchausen's, what do they mean by that? And so I had to Google it. I'm like, oh, I knew that there was, a condition people can have where they would cause harm or withhold something their child needs or whatever, but I didn't even know the term. And so that was another kind of side to our situation. We've given our very lives to protect kids, right? That's what we've chosen to do. It wasn't our choice. It was God, helping us change our perspective of what was most important, how we should be serving. That is like what we live and breathe every day and night. And that is something that, I still work through, of being accused of the opposite of what you live for. There's just something very strange about that.
Right.
Very jolting. So we had our interview. Our investigator met our children. All of them had to be seen.
And did all of this happen in your home, or did you have to go to a doctor's office?
Yeah.
What was the process?
Moment in our home, and one daughter was gone at her brother's house, and we actually had to arrange for her to meet up with the investigator that very day. So we didn't even get to see her or comfort her, and all of a sudden, she's being questioned by an investigator, and she's wondering what's going to happen to my siblings. Like, from serving in foster care, she knew some of the nuts and bolts that happens,
Right.
and so that just kind of ripped her world apart.
Right.
And brought about a whole bunch of insecurity and concern. And
yeah, and rightfully so. And especially for a child who's probably come from a hard place to have ended up, in a situation where they are adopted by another family.
Absolutely. So we didn't hear a whole lot after that. I gave him a long list of people. We are networked with tons of people. We have staff in our home every day or night, one of the two. There's someone here every single 24-hour period, hired to help people that, see us with our kids, people that take care of our kids without us. So they see them both individually and in their family environment. We listed off doctors to contact. We did all of that, and then we didn't hear a whole lot. And they have like 2 months, 60 days to wrap up an investigation. If there is reason to prolong that, they can. And we were coming up into that second month, and I'm thinking, we haven't gotten a paper in the mail saying everything's fine, but we also haven't heard from anyone. And by then, our other core people knew what was going on, and our staff knew, and everyone's saying, we've not heard from anybody. No one's ever called. And I'm thinking, okay, so what's happening? But yet, you're in the middle of no control, and you're afraid if you do anything, it might be perceived wrong, right? So you don't know what to do. And so as that was wrapping up, I got a call from our investigator again with his supervisor, and was told that this had been, a very big investigation. There was nothing that they could find. So they were really scrambling to know what to do with us, because once an investigation is open, you have to have a way to close it. So they were trying to figure out, how do we close this investigation? So they worked with our local hospital staff and made arrangements for the children to come in and have a clearance done, like a medical clearance. And we didn't know the nuts and bolts or length of time of all of that. But during that time, that was on a Thursday, and Wednesday, the day before, we had just placed our daughter on hospice care. Her condition had just declined so much, mostly being pain and not being able to give her quality of life and comfort. And so that was a very, people can imagine that's a very sensitive time in your walk with a loved one when you're facing those things. And so the supervisor said, well, she would be exempt from having to come to the hospital for that. And then it came time the next day, and they didn't follow that rule. So she actually was put in the hospital. And we kind of knew what was coming just from our history of working with the system. We figured that when our kids went to the hospital, there was going to be a time of, maybe we couldn't be bedside, or, we didn't know how that was going to look. And then the flip side of that is, this isn't a typical child with like a broken arm. Sometimes you have a allegation on a child had a broken arm. But even if you're not in the room with that child, they can tell you, I heard I need to go to the bathroom. This is how my arm got broken. I mean, they have those tools. Right. And so we were placing, two of the most vulnerable children that didn't have any of those tools at the mercy of people who it was an absolute disaster. The staff, we were very known there. We were very loved there. Watching them go through this and experience this was very traumatic as well. They were left with what do we do? And then, they see DCFS involved and everyone gets worried in the medical world because they don't want to be found wrong or negligent. They're trying
Of
to
course.
process.
Right.
And they're figure out, no one knew how to clear us. No one knew what to do.
Mhm.
And they said, normally we don't see this. Normally a child comes into the hospital because of a diagnosis, and that's where an investigation starts.
Mhm.
So our particular medical facility had not experienced someone coming from the outside being made inpatient to clear themselves.
Mhm.
So it was a lot of confusion. Of course, it happened on a weekend, so nothing really happened.
Right.
Staff was scrambling, and Joy, like we said, we just put her on hospice because we could not get her comfortable. So now
Mhm.
all the things she was on were being brought into question.
Mhm.
And typically what you do with those type of cases is like you remove supports the child is receiving to see if they really need it.
Right.
So for example, she was taken off a seizure medication because does she really need it? And that sent her spiraling.
Mhm.
Just horrifically. So to put into perspective, we had in our situation, DCFS did follow the law. So I know
Mhm.
some families in these situations, there comes a point where DCFS breaks a law, and
Right.
then that puts you into another category. So in one way it was good, right? Because that did not happen in our situation.
Mhm.
They did follow the law, but even following the law causes so much added harm to the child in many cases, not always, but in many cases.
Yeah, and
And
I would just interject here that varies from state to state, what they can do, what they're willing to do, what they're willing to not do, perhaps in situations like yours where the family is already known. And I mean, it should have just been, perhaps a conversation with a few doctors and staff in the hospital to, get this resolved quickly. But suffice to say, there's a tremendous amount of power that is placed within those organizations, and it is absolutely not always wielded appropriately.
yes.
And that is a whole separate issue that we cannot solve, and that's not the purpose of this, but just church leaders need to be aware that that is absolutely a thing. And then the penalties for making a false allegation vary greatly from state to state. I mean, in most cases, a false allegation, a single false allegation is a misdemeanor. But, of course, if you make multiple ones, that rises to the level of a felony. But I mean, what's the dollar value of what happened to your family? I mean, it's incalculable. I mean,
Right.
and you're going to continue talking
Right.
some more about what, the after effects of this were, but I mean, it's incalculable. And so it's, there is so much opportunity from a legislative perspective to make this better. And so that, again, that's not the purpose of this, but just, I wanted to acknowledge both of those things in what you're talking about.
And I think that brings up a really key point. We assumed in situations like this, like we're aware this happens, right? We advocate for help families through crisis, just from being in the adoptive fostering world. And we always assumed that the current team that knows the child and their diagnoses would be the ones involved in those decisions.
That makes sense, right?
Yes. And so we had no idea that what happens is an outside person is contracted to come in. And this is all over America. It's called abuse pediatrician. They're contracted to come in. They know no history besides like Joy's, her particular file is 6,000 pages long, her medical file. So you imagine like, it's not like you're going to be able to thumb through that quickly, right?
Right.
So we have learned that, doctors themselves are frustrated with the system and what happens to their families because they're not even the ones looked at for the truth when allegations come. And so,
and frankly, when your whole job is, when you're, hate to be pithy again, but when, your only tool is a hammer, you are a child abuse doctor seeking that out, everything you see is going to look from, you're looking at it from that abusive lens, so if you got a hammer, everything that you see is a nail. And mean, and I mean, I would just say that, it's very easy for all of us to get this tunnel vision around what we do, that we try to fit, what we know, everything that comes into our lives into what we know and, what our expertise is. And so, again, this is not, the church, this is just so that the church is aware that this is an approach that is taken across the country in many states and many localities. So, all right. So
most of the church leaders would be aware of what if one of their youth gets involved in a DUI. Like most church, they kind of know the law of the land, right? And is, for context, important that they realize, oh, when this happens, this is like a really, really big deal.
Right.
And the drawn out thing that can last for years in a family. So to put in perspective where we were, you have to agree to a safety plan right away. So when our kids were admitted, we agreed to a safety plan, and that means parents will not be allowed to be alone with their child. Okay. And so we knew that from being in the foster care world. So we had in our mind who would be those people for us. But in our situation, it was within 15 minutes, our investigator wanted a contact person and to be at the hospital to sign papers that they would be the safety person. And it's like, I mean, here you just left your children down the hall. You don't know when you'll ever see them again because you haven't been told what rules you have.
Right.
And you're trying to find these people. And so that's where the church can just really step in.
So what did your church do that was supportive, or what do you wish they had done perhaps that would have been more supportive?
The first thing our church did was when we got our knock on the door, I did ask permission to finish up the kids' cares so that I could, I had IV stuff out and like I couldn't leave that the way it was. So
and let's just reiterate, Joy had gone on hospice the day before.
Yeah, it was that weekend, our plan was to plan funeral services, so that would be done. I mean, that's just where we were in life. So it was like you were just jolted in so many directions. And so I asked for 10 minutes before he came in. Could I just get the kids, dressed or at least whatever and not be so exposed? We have lines and ileostomies and G-tube and J-tube and we try to provide them the best dignity we can. And so we did get awarded that few minutes. And so the first thing I did was I called our pastor and said, we are in need. Can you please stop what you're doing and come to my house right now? I knew that if he couldn't, there was no time to explain, right? But if he couldn't, I needed a person. Because for everyone's safety, I just wanted a third person here on the property.
Absolutely.
No idea what happened. It's not like my kids can even get up and, protect themselves or whatever. And so that was the first thing we did. And that pastor came and he came immediately. And all he did was sat in my other children and hung out. He didn't know the details. He didn't need to know the details. He just needed to show up. I mean, that is like the biggest thing that the church needs to do is just show up. And you're not going to be able to fix anything. You're not going to know exactly the ins and outs of what's true and what's not, and what's been misperceived. And that doesn't even really matter.
Right.
The family needs you to just show up.
Right.
Just like Jesus would. I mean, really, it's not hard, right? As we think about, what should we do? Well, he just went to those that were hurting. He went to those that were in trouble. He went to those who, were in situations that he didn't always change. He didn't always fit everything where he went. But he
didn't heal everybody, did he?
Yes. So that was the first thing. And then the day that we had to take our children into the hospital, they didn't have a bed for our son. The hospital had mixed things up and didn't tell us they had a bed for him. So we didn't take him to the hospital. We only took our daughter first. The next morning we had got a call saying, your wife must bring your son right now, or we're sending an ambulance to collect him at the house with, paramedics that would take custody of him. And so in that moment, I thought I need someone to go be with my children, right? Because I had no idea what else was going to happen. I knew I had to go back and get them. And someone popped into my head, and she's a longtime friend. she loves my kids. She's involved with them in youth group. And I called her and I said, hey, it's Shelly. I have an emergency. I need to know if for the next 48 hours, you can go to my home and stay with my children. And I need you to be there within 15 minutes. And she paused and said, yes. Now she knew in her own mind, she had to delegate a whole bunch of things in her world.
Right.
In that moment, she chose to be there and to be the church and to step in. And so that's how we started with church being involved. Others came to the hospital to just be with us. I think that was like, it's not even knowing the right thing to say, or, I mean, what can you say in those moments?
That's right. I personally have found that, when you're in a situation that's really challenging, it's just to tell the person you love them. I mean, there's nothing else you can say, there's probably not any words that are going to make it better, but, just to be that presence and to let somebody know that you love them is huge.
Absolutely. And I think for church leaders, it's important to know, like, we're talking about families that have been falsely accused, but you're going to also have families within your church body, that the allegations are true, right? Because
that's right.
And so regardless of what the outcome is, what the church needs to do is all the same. They need to just be there, because no matter the outcome, that family needs support. Right. And it's the responsibility to not leave them stranded, and show up and walk with them.
And as hard as it is, I mean, if it is a person who has actually done what they've been accused of, they need repentance. They need, and we have the justice system, flawed as it is, to provide, intervention so that people can repent. I mean, putting it in spiritual and Christian terms, but it's an opportunity for them to repent, to change what they have been doing. And I mean, we know that, hugely effective ministry is needed and is actually being done in the prison system every day. So, I appreciate you saying that, because it's impossible to know in that moment. I mean, even if it's somebody you've known for a long time, I mean, nobody wants to think that they know somebody, but that, it's like the mental health statistics. It's 1 in 4 people everywhere have a diagnosable mental health condition. Well, those are people that even if they're not wearing a sign that says, I have a mental health condition. It's the same kind of thing with these kinds of statistics. So I just want to say again, if you've got a question, definitely put it in the chat, put it on the Facebook live stream. I appreciate that, people are in both places. Someone has asked about, how you took care of yourself in this situation. What did you do? Did you find some way, to carve out some time, or did you have mental time within this, to make sure that you could stay together? What was that like for you?
So it's interesting because in the hallway of the hospital, once we got the children settled, the investigator asked us to follow him. And we knew, what was coming, right? And so we went into this private room, and he was so concerned and nervous and prepping me for what he was going to have to tell me, and said, you're going to go crazy. You're going to lose it. You're going to start crying. And I said, what do you need to tell me? Because my priority was keeping it together for my kids. And I knew that no matter what they said we needed to do, we needed to follow it, because that's the only hope for children getting what they need, is for us to be in alignment with the law. And that is really hard to do. And I will say that as Christians, I believe we kind of get an attitude sometimes. If we agree with the law, we don't really have trouble following the law. But when we disagree with the law, we like to think, well, that's not right. And so we can choose. But reality is, your children's, their very lives depend on you being willing to follow the law and challenge. And I think it goes against the grain of, even the church and Christians of, we don't like to be told to do stuff, right? Especially if it's not in the best interest of our children. And absolutely what we were being asked to do was not in the best interest of our children, but it was not against the law.
Right.
And so we tried to really focus on that. So this investigator's waiting for me just to freak out, right? And he told me what he had to tell me. And it was, I had 15 minutes to find someone to be our safety person, right? And so we went into that mode, and he said, what? He almost thought maybe I was crazy because I wasn't going crazy. Like, he's trying to figure out, like, who are you? Like, why aren't you upset? And I said, oh, I am. And there will be time for that. But right now, my kids, their condition, their lives, their everything depends on me keeping it together. And right now my focus is, I know you've already told me you don't want to be here on a Saturday. And so we're getting this done, and we're going to find our people that we can both agree to being our safety plan. And then I will process that later. So some of that is like compartmentalizing. As far as we pulled on our people, we called on our people who have been there for us through lots of other traumas and medical, situations. We've been in very many situations that were life and death with our kids. And so we kind of walked those things before. We did that. We tried to, that simple list of make sure I'm drinking water, make sure I'm getting a little bit of protein each day. Do I have any tools in my toolbox that could help me to be the best me I can be? Whether that is, you've learned that, taking a hot shower is relaxing for you, or maybe you're someone who has medication. My husband has RA. And so for him, if he were to forget to take his medication, that would send him in a total other spiral. So just making sure you're doing those right things each day, kind of like if you met someone that just lost their home, or they were just in a horrific car accident, you focus on basic needs, making sure those are done. And then knowing you're going to have a lifetime of healing ahead.
And I think that that's a really good thing for churches to be aware of too, is that, you don't need to have a list for every member of your church, in terms of, what they need support with. But if somebody is really having a hard time mentally processing what's going on, I mean, just think about your own life and the things that you have to do to take care of yourself, and maybe make some notes. And then, if that person, if the Shelly in your circumstance is really having a hard time thinking about how to take care of herself, just go through some of those items. Do you have, medication with you at the hospital that you need? Do you have food? Do you have snacks? Do you have water? Just all the things. I mean, it's really trying to understand what is needed in the moment to help this person be able to continue doing what he or she needs to do.
A lot of it's the practical things. Like we needed a place to stay that night. We never stay anywhere but our children's rooms. We have never before this left our child alone in the hospital. They like the complexities they have require someone to be an advocate there. And so, we're thinking, oh my goodness, like, where are we going to sleep tonight? I don't know. And so we had a friend that took it upon herself. She booked a hotel and told us where we would be staying. This, for tonight, it's taken care of. We'll deal with tomorrow. But
in my opinion, that's an excellent use of church benevolent resources, because these things do happen. And one thing that you and I messaged about before the webinar was just talking about, for example, I mean, your stay, with your children lasted, how long was it? Like a week?
Inpatient.
Okay. So, but, for people who may have an extended time period, or where, it's maybe a greater distance away. I mean, there are so many things that can create not only this mental, emotional, spiritual burden and the physical burden on the children, the vulnerable people in the situation, that can really create this snowball of a significant financial burden too. And are you connected with people that have had that kind of challenge kind of added on to
There's statistics out there that show, like, how many people that go through this end up having bankruptcy, and you can see that. Like for us, we're a one income family. And so like during this time overnight, my husband had to, leave the job site because here
Right.
he is trying to, do what needs done. So for us, he didn't lose his job because he owns his own business
Right.
and customers, he's a very reputable person. They understand. However, the paycheck stops, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
And
exactly.
so
And the bills do not.
you're racking up new bills. And where am I going
Right.
to stay in? What are we going to do? And just getting a bite to eat,
Mhm.
we don't typically go out much. And we were
Mhm.
just astonished of how those bills were going to rack up so quickly. So simple things, filling the car up with gas,
Mhm.
making sure, you're going to have some situations, I think, when you deal with benevolence in a church family where you feel very comfortable handing them something and say, this is for your gas. Or if
Mhm.
you don't feel comfortable with that, ask them to take their car and
Mhm.
go physically and fill it up. You can do
Right.
those. Being willing to be there. The other thing I would say to be very conscientious about, the church leadership needs to understand that this is extremely delicate information. And so as the church, we often, we send out prayer requests, right? We send out, oh, pray for so-and-so. And I think it needs to be said that not everyone in your church may be a safe person for
That's
this
right.
family.
That's right.
In a lot of situations, it's been another person in the church or what have you that's made an allegation. That happens.
Mhm.
So how we handled that was we sent a very specific update to our church leadership, and they knew that did not go beyond.
Mhm.
Those were like 6 key men in the church. So they would know what was happening. And I think sometimes we get into like numbers and stuff, and we don't need 200 people up to speed with what's happening in your
That's
life
right.
there.
That's right.
That small group, and just being discerning, and your leadership
Mhm.
can really provide, be an example in that
Mhm.
of, how to handle that delicate information. And then those church leaders were there to help with some of the practical things. Someone was looking out to make sure, someone came to the hospital. And so we could be in our children's rooms as long as one of our people on our list were with us.
Mhm.
And the other time we stayed in the lobby because at any moment, we left Joy's room one night, and because of medication changes that had happened, she had a 104-degree fever and her heart rate was sitting in the 180s.
Oh my gracious.
And this went on for hours. And we did not know if she would physically survive that trauma.
Right.
But we still had to leave the room at the end of the day.
Right.
So having people come to us, we would just wait out in the lobby. And since we were following all the rules, we didn't have issues with staff. We didn't have issues even with, DCFS. We obeyed what we agreed to.
Mm-hmm.
And that was that. And we let the staff, we are here. If you have any questions, you come to us. Otherwise, we're going to step back and let you do what you need to do. Because if we did not, go along and, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Comply with that plan. If we didn't do that, next is they take custody of your kids.
Right.
And you no longer see them. And we knew that was there. And so that's kind of how we handled the delicacies. So maybe, one of our church people were out in the lobby with us. One particular night, Joy was seizing uncontrollably. And they weren't giving her anything to help because there was a question of, was it a true seizure? And so your people that come to be with you, they need to know that they're going to walk into trauma. Right. And it's going to be like walking into that tragic car accident or the house just burned down. And they're going to see the rawness of the family that's there. And they just need to just be there.
Right. Which really underscores, that the importance of making sure that, it's people that are equipped to be able to come alongside and not add to the burden of the family or the individual who's vulnerable.
Yes. So I went back and forth between Joy's room and then going back to the lobby where our church, our loved one was with my husband. And, I would just cry and get it all out there. And I mean, sometimes it just brought you to the point of being ill, because you felt sick to yourself, it was suffering needlessly. And then I would, pull it together then and be able to go back and be who I needed to be bedside and speak to everyone with respect. And so sometimes your church family can just also be that outlet, because you do have those gruesome feelings and, that control and trauma and just being gracious with the family of just being there and just your presence, just knowing that they're sit with you. And we talked a little bit about lament.
Yes.
You say to a family, but I remember the most powerful thing a church member did. It brought such comfort. To this day, I go back to the memory and I just feel the comfort. He opened the Bible and he started reading excerpts of times when people were just hurting so badly, and yet the Lord was near. And they were not forgotten. They weren't healed. They weren't rescued from the situation, but he was there and they were cared for and loved. That brought me more comfort than anybody being able to say, oh, this is going to be okay. And, things are going to get better and God's going to provide this and that. But just remind me that there were people that walked before me who found themselves in terrible situations. And
God was with them.
Right. Yeah. Nothing was good, but he was good. Yeah. And he was there and just reminding me of that. And I will never forget, that's how we comfort others. Right.
Exactly. Exactly.
And it's very powerful.
Yeah. So we have 8 minutes. I mean, this has gone by super fast, but I mean, it's such helpful, critical information. I mean, it just really is, because church leaders do find themselves in situations where it is really difficult to discern, what's up, what's down, and just underscoring what you've just recently said in the last few minutes about, reminding people that God is with them is just such a huge comfort when you are just in the fog of, whatever the challenge is. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about forgiveness and how have you gotten to a place where you feel that you have forgiven the person who made the allegation, who filed the report that started all of this? Where are you in that process? And maybe where are your older children who had to be involved with this somewhat as bystanders, but, also involved? Where are you with that today?
So for a lot of people, I know for us, ours was all anonymous. So we will never know exactly where all this came from. So probably where we focus most is on, we still work with the same providers that we always have, right? And that was a big concern. In our case, it wasn't a broken arm that we were being accused of breaking our child's arm, but really it was an accident. Okay. And that goes away, and that typical child goes on, and you don't live in the medical world anymore. Right. But we the medical world was going to continue to stay day in and day out. And these people that were being called in to look at everything were going to be the same people that we faced, weekly in the years ahead to care for our kids. So we really went in and focused a lot on that. I was involved in the hospital, on some committees there, and we just stayed connected. And we tried to remember that anyone involved in a situation, in their own mind, they were trying to do what was right. Correct? No matter how wrong and terrible it was. Right. Their mind, they had so much information, and they were trying to, in their own mind, do what was right. And so with that comes kind of just, I don't know, it helped kind of remove some of that and to focus on what was important. So for our situation, this has still been our hospital. We just got home from there last week, and we never dreamed we'd be able to walk back in that building, right? Because it's full of so much trauma, and yet we have. And what we see is a medical system has risen up and seen what can happen. And we have seen such a positive change in care and supports.
That's fabulous.
seen, you know, things go up to management and then realize, oh, there are these gaps. And sometimes when a kid has gaps, and then this family has to keep advocating that they have needs that aren't getting met. And then, you know, some kook thinks that they're, you know, crazy, where really they were put into this situation that was impossible.
Right.
And so much good come of an awareness of complex kids in our local hospital and the willingness of people to step up. But with that came, like, you know, at any moment, my child could have an obstruction and I'm going to need to hand her off to people who may or may not have been involved in our case. And I think a lot of that is just accepting that none of this took God by surprise, right? And he was with us through all of it. Having someone to talk to is critical. You know, it's been a lot of it, you know, people talk about self-care. And for me, I try to think of it as I'm just one of the things on Joy's list that she needs every day. And mom care of, right? And so instead of doing it for me, it's, you know, I am, if nothing else, I'm doing it for Joy so that I can be the best person for her that I can be. But that is critical. For us, you know, it was pulling from resources around us to talk through those hard things and to process it. And how do I keep moving on with all of this trauma? And is God gonna keep showing up? And, you know, what do I do with the pain and the hurt? And that's where the church body can be very powerful as well, months later, just being to be there. Yeah.
Well, and it does sound like, you know, you've been, you know, God has definitely gone ahead of this situation for you and provided, you know, people that were trustworthy and leadership in your church that you could rely on and that could step into action at a moment's notice. And so, you know, if you are a church leader watching this, you know, we are getting to the end of our time with Shelly Roberts, but, you know, I heard an awful lot in this about, you know, opportunities for churches to step up. And most of these things are very relational. It has, you know, really very little to do with your personal career or your, you know, any expertise with children that with complex medical needs, but it really is just being willing to be used by God at a time when someone in your, you know, your faith community has a significant need. So, I mean, there are an endless array of things that can be done as we, you know, kind of touched on earlier from a legislative perspective. I mean, if you've got attorneys in your church, you know, they may be able to help come alongside, you know, offering services pro bono to the family if you know, there's that sort of need that comes in. But you know, I mean, bottom line, you know, I'm hearing, I mean, even though it hasn't been that long after this all resolved, but I'm hearing that God is like we like to say, he's Romans 8:28ing this situation already. It is not a good situation. It was not a good situation for anybody, but he is making good from this situation. And sometimes that good, you know, really manifests in just what you described, just the steadfastness that, you know, we can have knowing that he is sovereign, even over these super challenging things. And what a witness that is to even hospital staff who, you know, you may not ever have a spiritual kind of conversation with about anything at all. So, well, Shelly, thank you so much for your time. We are going to have several links that are in the show notes that are just different resources that, you know, Shelly and I either talked about or I uncovered doing research for this. And I just encourage you, if this is a situation in your life or something that, you know, is occurring in your church or even your extended community, you know, definitely reach out to me, Catherine@keyministry.org. If you have a question for Shelly, I'm happy to route anything to her that you would like for her to address specifically. But again, Shelly, thank you so much for your time and look forward to hearing continued good reports on your beautiful family.
Thank you.
All right, take care.